Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The aftermath of Jonah's decision to choose Ethan over his family and faith was anything but peaceful. Word traveled quickly within the tight-knit Mormon community, and soon, whispers of scandal followed Jonah wherever he went. His mission leader, once stern but patient, now regarded him with thinly veiled disdain. Even his fellow missionaries avoided him, their disapproval palpable in every sidelong glance and awkward silence. For a brief moment, Jonah had felt liberated, free from the suffocating expectations that had defined his life for so long. But freedom came at a cost, and the weight of isolation began to press down on him. He tried to focus on Ethan, on the warmth of their shared moments, and the promise of a future together. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, the voices of doubt lingered in the back of his mind, whispering cruel reminders of everything he'd lost. Ethan noticed the change almost immediately. Gone was the tentative joy that had blossomed after their first kiss. In its place was a quiet melancholy that clung to Jonah like a shadow. One evening, as they sat together on Ethan's couch, Jonah stared blankly at the television screen, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "You're not okay," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question, it was an observation, delivered with the kind of blunt honesty only someone who truly cared could muster. Jonah sighed, running a hand through his hair. I keep thinking about them," he admitted softly. "My parents, my mission leader, everyone who thinks I've ruined my life." "You haven't ruined your life," Ethan countered firmly, turning to face him. "You've chosen to live it. There's a difference." Jonah shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "It doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It feels like I'm being punished for wanting something real, for wanting you." Ethan reached out, taking Jonah's hand in his own. "Then let me help you fight back," he urged. "You don't have to do this alone." But even as Ethan spoke, he knew the battle wouldn't be easy. Jonah's struggle wasn't just internal. It was external, too, and the forces arrayed against them were far more powerful than either of them had anticipated. 2 days later, Jonah received a letter from his parents. It was short, cold, and unyielding, a formal declaration of their disappointment and a demand that he return home immediately. They promised forgiveness if he renounced his relationship with Ethan and recommitted himself to the church. If he refused, they warned they would sever all ties with him permanently. Jonah read the letter twice, his hands trembling as the words sank in. When Ethan found him sitting on the edge of his bed, tears streaming down his face, he didn't need to ask what had happened. "They want me to come home," Jonah choked out, clutching the letter tightly. "They say they'll forgive me if I leave you behind." Ethan knelt in front of him, his heart breaking at the sight of Jonah's anguish. "And what do you want?" "I want to stay," Jonah replied without hesitation. "But I don't know if I can. Every part of me is screaming to run, to escape before they take everything away." "Then go," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. Jonah looked up sharply, his eyes wide with shock. "What? If leaving is what you need to do right now, then go," Ethan repeated, forcing himself to meet Jonah's gaze. "I won't hold you back, Jonah. Not when your whole world is falling apart. But what about us?" Jonah demanded, his voice cracking. Ethan swallowed hard, fighting back his own tears. "We'll figure it out. Whatever happens, I'll wait for you." The next morning, Jonah packed his bags in silence. Ethan stood by the door, watching as the man he loved prepared to walk away. Not because he wanted to, but because he didn't see any other way forward. "I'll find you," Jonah promised, his voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what, I'll find you again." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As Jonah stepped out into the hallway, he turned back one last time, his eyes filled with pain and determination. Then, with a final nod, he disappeared. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan heard nothing from Jonah. The apartment felt emptier than ever, each room echoing with memories of their time together. Just as Ethan began to lose hope, a familiar figure appeared at the cafe where he worked, one that made his heart stop. Chapter 6: The Aftermath. Life without Jonah was a hollow shell of what it had been. Ethan threw himself into his art and work, using the chaos of deadlines and late-night painting sessions to numb the ache in his chest. But no matter how many canvases he covered or cups of coffee he served, the void remained, a gaping wound that refused to heal. Meanwhile, Jonah struggled to adjust to life back home. His parents' house felt foreign, its walls closing in around him as they lectured him endlessly about repentance and redemption. They introduced him to Sarah, a devout young woman from their congregation whom they hoped would help him find his way. Jonah endured their attempts at matchmaking with gritted teeth, knowing full well that none of it mattered. His heart still belonged to Ethan, and no amount of pressure could change that. Desperate to reach out, Jonah wrote a letter to Ethan, a raw, heartfelt confession of his love and regret. He poured his soul onto the page, detailing the torment of living under his parents' roof and the guilt of leaving Ethan behind. But when he mailed the letter, it never reached its destination. Whether it was lost in transit or intercepted by his parents, neither of them would ever know. One afternoon, as Ethan cleaned tables at the cafe, he spotted a familiar face standing in line. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a mirage born of longing and exhaustion. But as the figure stepped closer, there was no mistaking the tall frame, the broad shoulders, the unmistakable intensity in those piercing eyes. "Jonah?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Jonah hesitated, his expression guarded but hopeful. "Hey," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cafe buzzed around them, oblivious to the reunion unfolding in its midst. Finally, Ethan broke the spell, stepping forward cautiously. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. "I needed to see you," Jonah replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Can we talk?" Ethan hesitated, torn between the urge to embrace Jonah and the fear of opening old wounds. "Okay," he said finally, leading him to a quiet corner of the cafe. As they sat across from each other, the weight of everything unsaid hung heavy in the air. Jonah began haltingly, explaining how he'd returned to the city in secret, unable to bear the thought of losing Ethan forever. "I couldn't stay away," he confessed, his voice cracking. "Not after everything we've been through." Ethan listened silently, his heart aching with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to forgive Jonah, to welcome him back with open arms. But another part, the part scarred by abandonment, was wary, unsure if he could trust him again. "I don't know if I can do this," Ethan admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Loving you almost destroyed me once. What makes you think it won't happen again?" Jonah reached across the table, his hand hovering uncertainly before resting lightly on Ethan's. "Because I'm ready to fight for us this time," he said firmly. "No matter what it takes." Ethan searched Jonah's eyes, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he nodded slowly, a flicker of hope reigniting in his chest. "Then we'll take it slow," he said softly. "One step at a time." Chapter 7: A Glimmer of Hope. The decision to take things slow was both a relief and a challenge for Ethan and Jonah. On one hand, it gave them the space they needed to rebuild trust and reconnect after months apart. On the other hand, the cautious pace felt agonizingly slow, especially when their hearts were screaming to close the distance between them. Jonah had rented a small studio apartment in the city, far enough from his parents' influence, but close enough to remain tethered to the life he'd built with Ethan. It was sparsely furnished, a mattress on the floor, a folding table, and a single chair, but it was his. For the first time in years, Jonah felt like he had control over his own destiny. Ethan, meanwhile, continued working at the cafe and painting late into the night. The vibrant colors that once filled his canvases had dimmed during Jonah's absence, replaced by muted tones and abstract shapes that reflected his inner turmoil. Now, as they began seeing each other again, hints of brightness started creeping back into his work, streaks of gold and crimson that mirrored the flicker of hope reigniting in his heart. Their meetings were tentative at first, held in neutral spaces like parks or coffee shops. They talked about everything and nothing: the weather, their favorite books, the awkwardness of small talk, and slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. One evening, as they walked along the riverfront, Jonah stopped suddenly, turning to face Ethan. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Ethan frowned, sensing the gravity in Jonah's tone. "What is it?" "I've been thinking a lot about my faith," Jonah admitted, staring at the ground. "And I don't think I can go back to the way things were." "Not completely." Ethan's breath caught. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Jonah nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I still believe in God. I always will. But I can't keep pretending that loving you is wrong. You make me better, Ethan. Stronger. Happier. And I don't want to lose that." For a moment, Ethan didn't know how to respond. He wanted to pull Jonah into his arms, to kiss him until neither of them could breathe. But instead, he settled for reaching out and squeezing Jonah's hand tightly. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear that," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened. They spent long hours exploring the city together, discovering hidden gems like tucked-away bookstores and rooftop gardens. Ethan introduced Jonah to his eclectic group of friends, who welcomed him with open arms despite their initial skepticism. In return, Jonah shared pieces of his past, stories about growing up in a strict household, the pressure to conform, and the loneliness that had haunted him for so long. But even as their bond grew stronger, challenges remained. Jonah's family cut off contact entirely, leaving him feeling like an outsider in the only community he'd ever known. Strangers stared and whispered when they saw the two men walking hand in hand, their judgmental gazes cutting deeper than either of them cared to admit. Through it all, Ethan became Jonah's anchor, the steady presence that reminded him why he'd chosen this path in the first place. One afternoon, as they sat side by side on a park bench, Jonah turned to Ethan with a hesitant smile. "Do you remember what you said to me when we first met? About finding peace?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Yeah, I do." "What?" "Because I think I finally understand what you meant," Jonah replied, his gaze softening. "Peace isn't about having all the answers. It's about being true to yourself, even when it's hard." Ethan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Jonah's forehead. "And are you at peace now?" Jonah hesitated, then nodded. "More than I've ever been." Just as things seemed to be falling into place, Jonah received an unexpected visit from his mission leader, who had tracked him down to deliver a final ultimatum. Caught between his newfound happiness and the remnants of his old life, Jonah wondered if he'd ever truly escaped the shadow of his past. Chapter 8. Rebuilding Trust. The knock on Jonah's apartment door came late one evening, jolting him out of a quiet moment of reflection. He opened it to find his former mission leader standing there, his expression grim and unyielding. "We need to talk," the man said without preamble, stepping inside before Jonah could protest. Ethan, who had been sitting on the couch sketching idly, looked up in surprise. "Who's this?" he asked cautiously. "This is my mission leader," Jonah explained, his voice tight with unease. "He's not here for a social call." The mission leader ignored Ethan entirely, focusing his attention squarely on Jonah. "You've strayed far from the path, son," he began, his tone heavy with disappointment. "But it's not too late to come back. Repentance is possible if you're willing to make the necessary sacrifices." Jonah clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I've already made my choice," he said firmly. "I'm done running from who I am." The mission leader's eyes narrowed. "And what about your eternal soul? Are you willing to gamble that on a fleeting romance?" "It's not fleeting," Ethan interjected, rising to his feet. "Jonah and I are building something real here, something worth fighting for." "That's not your decision to make." Ethan shot back, his protective instincts kicking in. Jonah stepped between them, his voice shaking but resolute. "Enough, both of you. This is my life, not yours to dictate." The mission leader sighed, shaking his head. "Very well, but know this, Jonah. If you continue down this path, there will be consequences. Your family, your community, they won't stand by you." "I know," Jonah replied quietly, "and I'm ready to face them." After the mission leader left, the apartment fell silent. Ethan watched Jonah carefully, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. "Are you okay?" he asked finally. Jonah nodded, though his hands were trembling. I hate that they won't leave me alone. Can't they see that I'm happy?" "They're scared," Ethan said gently. "Change is hard for people like that. But none of it matters unless you're happy." Jonah sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "I wish I could turn off the guilt. Every time someone disapproves, it feels like a piece of me breaks." Ethan sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "Then let me help you heal those pieces. Together, we'll get through this." Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Jonah leaned on each other more than ever. They attended support groups for LGBTQ+ individuals navigating religious trauma, where Jonah found solace in hearing others share similar struggles. Ethan encouraged him to journal his thoughts, using writing as a form of therapy. Slowly but surely, Jonah began to shed the weight of shame that had burdened him for so long. One evening, as they lay entwined on Ethan's bed, Jonah turned to him with a soft smile. "Thank you," he murmured, "for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Ethan kissed his forehead tenderly. "Always. That's what love is, isn't it? Believing in someone even when they can't see the light themselves." Jonah nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I love you, Ethan, more than words can say." "And I love you," Ethan replied, pulling him closer. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together." As their bond deepened, Jonah realized that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of others' judgments. It was also about forgiving himself. With Ethan by his side, he began to embrace the truth that happiness wasn't selfish. It was essential. Chapter 9. Facing the World Together. As winter gave way to spring, Ethan and Jonah found themselves navigating a delicate balance between their private world of love and the harsh realities of the outside world. Their relationship had grown stronger with each passing day, but the challenges they faced were far from over. The judgmental stares, whispered insults, and outright hostility from strangers were constant reminders that their love was still seen as unacceptable by many. One particularly difficult evening, after attending a local art gallery opening where Ethan's work was featured, the couple encountered a group of protesters outside the venue. Armed with signs bearing slogans like "Sin has no place in art" and "Repent or perish," the protesters shouted hateful remarks at anyone who dared to challenge their narrow worldview. Ethan clenched his fists as he led Jonah away from the scene, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. "Ignore them," he muttered under his breath. "They don't matter." But Jonah couldn't ignore them, not completely. He felt the weight of their words pressing down on him, dredging up old fears and doubts he thought he'd left behind. "Do you ever wonder if they're right?" he asked quietly as they walked back to Ethan's apartment. Ethan stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "No," he said firmly, "because love isn't a sin, Jonah. If anything, it's the purest thing we have." Jonah nodded, though his eyes betrayed lingering uncertainty. "I know that in my head. It's just hard to believe it in my heart sometimes." Ethan reached out, cupping Jonah's face in his hands. "Then let me remind you every single day until you do." The tension escalated further when Jonah's parents discovered he was living in the city again. They arrived unannounced one afternoon, banging on his apartment door with a ferocity that startled both men. "We need to talk," Jonah's father barked, pushing past Ethan without so much as a glance. Ethan stepped aside, exchanging a worried look with Jonah before following them into the cramped living room. "Why are you here?" Jonah demanded, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "To bring you home," his mother replied, her tone icy. "We've heard about your lifestyle. This isn't who you are, Jonah. You're better than this." "No," Jonah shot back, his voice rising. "This is who I am. And if you can't accept that, then maybe you shouldn't be part of my life anymore." His parents stared at him in stunned silence, clearly unprepared for such defiance. Finally, his father spoke, his voice low and menacing. "If you walk away now, don't expect us to welcome you back. This is your last chance." Jonah hesitated, tears welling in his eyes. For a moment, Ethan thought he might cave, overwhelmed by the pressure. But then, with a deep breath, Jonah straightened his shoulders and met his father's gaze head on. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he said softly but firmly. "But I can't live my life for anyone else's approval, not even yours." Without another word, his parents turned and left, slamming the door behind them. The apartment fell silent, the air thick with emotion. Later that night, as Jonah lay awake staring at the ceiling, Ethan wrapped his arms around him, holding him close. "You did the right thing," Ethan murmured, kissing the back of Jonah's neck. "Even if it doesn't feel like it right now. I just wish it didn't hurt so much," Jonah admitted, his voice trembling. "It's supposed to hurt," Ethan replied gently. "Letting go of something or someone you love never comes easy. But sometimes it's the only way to move forward." Jonah turned to face him, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What if I lose everything? My family, my faith, all of it? Then we'll build something new," Ethan promised. "Something ours. And we'll make sure it's filled with love, laughter, and everything that makes life worth living." Over the next few months, Ethan and Jonah leaned heavily on each other, drawing strength from their shared resilience. They joined LGBTQ plus advocacy groups, volunteering their time to support others facing similar struggles. Through these experiences, Jonah began to see his journey not as a loss, but as an opportunity to redefine what faith meant to him, to create a community that embraced rather than rejected, and to live authentically without apology. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of Ethan's apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jonah turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "I think I finally understand what happiness means," he said softly. "It's not about having everything figured out. It's about being okay with the messiness, the questions, the doubts, the imperfections." Ethan smiled, reaching out to intertwine their fingers. "And loving each other through all of it." Jonah nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Yeah, loving each other through all of it." As they prepare to celebrate Ethan's upcoming art gallery opening, Jonah realized that their love story wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving. Together, they had faced judgment, rejection, and pain, yet they had emerged stronger, more united than ever. Chapter 10: A New Beginning. The night of Ethan's art gallery opening was a whirlwind of excitement and nerves. The space buzzed with energy as friends, acquaintances, and strangers milled about, admiring the vibrant paintings that lined the walls. Each piece told a story of struggle, hope, passion, and ultimately triumph. At the center of it all stood Ethan, his usual confidence tempered by a quiet vulnerability. He scanned the crowd anxiously, searching for one face in particular. When his eyes finally landed on Jonah, standing near the entrance with a proud smile, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "You came," Ethan said softly as Jonah approached. "Of course I did," Jonah replied, pulling him into a warm embrace. "Did you think I missed this?" Ethan laughed, the sound tinged with relief. "Not really, but it's nice to see you here." Jonah stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the room. "This is amazing, Ethan. Your work, it's breathtaking." Ethan shrugged modestly. "It's just stuff I threw together. Nothing special. Don't sell yourself short," Jonah countered. "These pieces are raw, honest, beautiful, just like you." Ethan blushed, ducking his head to hide his grin. "Well, there's one painting I want you to see. It's kind of for you." Curious, Jonah followed Ethan to a secluded corner of the gallery, where a large canvas hung slightly apart from the others. The painting depicted two figures standing beneath a starry sky, their silhouettes intertwined in a tender embrace. In the background, streaks of gold and crimson illuminated the darkness, symbolizing hope and resilience. "This is us," Ethan explained, his voice soft. "Our journey, all the pain, the joy, the moments that made us who we are today." Jonah stared at the painting, his throat tightening with emotion. "It's perfect," he whispered, "just like us." As the evening wore on, Ethan and Jonah mingled with guests, sharing stories and soaking in the admiration of those who appreciated Ethan's art. For once, they weren't hiding in the shadows. They were stepping boldly into the light, unapologetic about who they were and what they represented. When the crowd began to thin, Ethan pulled Jonah aside, leading him to a quiet rooftop terrace overlooking the city. The lights twinkled below them, casting a warm glow over their faces. "I wanted to say thank you," Ethan said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "For what?" Jonah asked, tilting his head curiously. "For believing in us," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For choosing me, even when it meant losing everything else. I don't think I could have done this without you." Jonah smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. "You would have been fine. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." "Maybe," Ethan conceded, "but I'm happiest when I'm strong with you." They stood there for a long moment, simply holding each other as the city pulsed with life around them. Weeks later, Ethan and Jonah moved into a cozy loft apartment downtown, combining their belongings and their lives in a celebration of their commitment to each other. The walls were soon adorned with Ethan's paintings, while shelves overflowed with books and trinkets that reflected their shared passions. On their first morning in the new space, Jonah woke to find Ethan already awake, sketching idly at the kitchen table. "What are you working on?" Jonah asked sleepily, wrapping his arms around Ethan's shoulders. "A new piece," Ethan replied, smiling up at him. "Inspired by you, of course." Jonah kissed the top of his head, his heart swelling with contentment. I used to think happiness was something I had to earn, but now I realize it's something we create together." Ethan set down his pencil, turning to face Jonah fully. "Then let's keep creating. Every day for the rest of our lives. Final climax. As they stood together in their new home, surrounded by evidence of their love and resilience, Ethan and Jonah knew they had found something rare and precious. A partnership built on trust, acceptance, and unwavering support. Though challenges would undoubtedly arise, they faced the future with courage, knowing they were stronger together than they could ever be apart.